So my name's Jason. I am the head of assurance technology over at the FRC in the UK. I also chair the FRC's Technology and Digital Steering Group, and I'm also a member of the IESBA Technology Experts Group. Thank you, Eric. What I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is I'm going to cover off a few different bits, some a bit touching on things that Eric's mentioned, and a few of the people around. I think ultimately I'd summarize it by saying, how do you pragmatically regulate for something like AI? We've thought about a lot of the really kind of detailed technical challenges. How do you explain AI? And I think one of the things that kind of gets a little bit lost in some conversations is how you actually practically do those kinds of things on a day-to-day basis. Because one of the problems we're finding, certainly as a regulator, is there are lots of tools available for people to start thinking about using, but people are not really sure how they take that first step, how they, start thinking about using some of these tools to improve audit quality. Before I kind of delve into some of the content, I'll just a quick thing on the FRC as an organization. So we are the UK's regulator responsible for promoting transparency and integrity. We set the UK Corporate Governance Code, we set accounting standards, we set assurance standards, we set some actuarial standards, although I know absolutely nothing about actuarial science, so please don't ask any questions about that. We're also what is known as the competent authority in the UK, which is essentially just legalese for we are the ones that supervise and then enforce and inspect audits in the UK, with a particular focus on public interest entities. We are eventually going to become a different regulator, but the UK sort of legislative process is a little bit sort of complex at the minute. We've got an election next year. It's a little bit messy. And so we will eventually change our name. We've been changing our name and getting different regulatory powers for about the last 3 years. It will eventually happen someday. So what I'm going to talk about then a little bit is AI from our perspective as a regulator in the UK. Where do we see the potential? Where do we see the negatives? What kind of guidance are we looking to publish? And how do we think we can make that work in a kind of global environment? I'm going to start off by defining AI, but a little bit differently to how it's previously been defined. This is the UK government's definition, and I use the phrase definition fairly broadly, of artificial intelligence. So at the beginning of this year, the UK government issued a white paper, which essentially contained its proposals for how the UK will regulate AI and its usage. And in doing that, the UK government defined AI extraordinarily broadly, essentially by reference to only 2 traits. The first was that it is in some way adaptable, so a system is trained either once or continuously, and that there is some kind of autonomy in the decision or output process. To say that this definition's come under a bit of scrutiny, I think would be charitable. One of the issues with this is you can think of AI, you can certainly think of some machine learning and AI tools that maybe don't really fall in that definition. And there are certainly tools that are not really machine learning tools that you could force into that definition. So one of the main things that we're trying to do as a regulator is not really redefine AI, but try to put together some guidelines for people preparing financial statements, for people auditing those financial statements, of what we would classify as AI in that context. So when I'm talking about AI, I'm kind of using this definition, but I'm acutely aware of the fact that that definition is a little bit nebulous. So a brief kind of thing on AI regulations. That's, I can actually answer a question that was asked earlier as well about the Bletchley Declaration that came out last week, which is the kind of UK response to Biden's executive order. So whilst the executive order in the US was 60 pages long, if you were to print out the Bletchley Declaration, which is the UK's equivalent, I'd say you might get a full side of A4 out of it if you put it in quite big text. To say it's light touch and principles oriented, I think, again, would be quite generous. I'd summarize it as saying, everyone who's been here has agreed we should do something. And that is about the end of it. Exactly. So in the EU, so despite Brexit many years ago, we still have a lot of alignment in the UK with EU legislation. The EU's approach to AI has been talked about a little bit, substantially more stringent than what's been proposed in the UK. So the EU's approach to regulation of AI has been a lot more risk focused. So certain kinds of AI tool have been outright banned. So things like social credit scoring, if it's done by a government agency, for example. Other kinds of tools are considered high risk. So they are tending to be tools that are used to make some kind of decision about a person, be that a medical one, suitability for finance, things of that nature. So the EU is quite stringent. There's a lot of resource going into creating centralized bodies that do a lot of work. And also to really think about how you categorize and divide AI up. In the UK, we're not doing that. What we're going to do instead in the UK, and this remains the proposal despite the summit last week on AI safety, is to take a very, very, very principles-based approach to regulating AI in the UK. Whether that will change next week, and as Eric said, one of the things with AI is it goes out of date, an hour after you've written the slide. As someone who's British, we then compound that by having a government that changes their mind every 30 seconds about what they're going to do about something. So it makes it incredibly difficult to be 100% sure that you know what is going to happen at any given point in time. But it remains the idea that in the UK, we will not be taking a very detailed risk-based approach to regulating AI. We'll instead set some core principles, and then each regulator in the UK will have to make sure that the people in their regulatory space are following those principles. So for us, as accountant and audit regulator, we would essentially say to people, here are the core principles, here are our existing standards and guidance, here is a document that bridges those. It tells you if you're doing an audit and you're using this kind of tool, this is what we expect around things like transparency, explainability, right to redress, things like that. So a lot more light touch than some of the suggestion, even compared to the executive audit here in the US, which is quite specific about the kinds of things that regulatory bodies are expected to be doing. We don't really have anything like that in the UK. We're going a little bit more seat of your pants, I believe, is the American phrase for it. So what are those principles? And so what principles are we going to use in the UK to regulate AI? There are 5 in the proposed approach to regulation: safety, security, and robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress. Again, one of the criticisms of regulation in the UK has been, can anybody really disagree with any of those things? Some of them are quite nebulous. Fairness, what does that actually mean? It's also not defined in any of the regulatory documents we have at the moment. So what we're trying to do as regulators is work out what these mean in our individual context. What does fair mean in the context of an audit engagement? What does appropriate transparency mean in the context of someone using a machine learning tool to help them develop a disclosure note for financial statements? So these are all applicable to everyone to a certain degree, but for us as an audit and accountancy regulator, we think that appropriate transparency and explainability and then accountability and governance are probably the 2 most important ones for us. We set the UK Corporate Governance Code, for example, so governance is almost certainly one that's important for us, and something we expect people will look to us to provide more additional detail on. So they're the principles that we essentially have to bear in mind as a regulator when, as the years go on, we're saying to people that we regulate, how are you using AI? How are you using machine learning? Are you doing it appropriately? Is it transparent? Can you explain how the tool's been used? It's quite a different approach. If I'm doing this chat in 2 months, this might have all changed if we decide to do something completely different, but that's just politics, eh? Why do we care? So it's interesting because although the last year has really blown up since ChatGPT was out, we've been thinking about AI and machine learning a lot at the FRC for a good few years. And the reason is, although it's a lot more popular now and people talk about generative AI a lot of firms have already been spending a lot of time thinking about how they can use particularly certain types of machine learning tools to help with audit quality, but also to help with audit efficiency. So For at least 3 years, I've been telling our board that we should have been interested in machine learning and AI. So I was kind of quite happy over the last year because at least I've been somewhat vindicated now and I don't just seem like a lunatic. We have a technology hub that I can put a link up to later, which essentially looks at all kinds of different technologies and prioritizes them in terms of what we'll spend regulatory resource looking at. AI and machine learning was already quite high on that spectrum anyway. And all that's really happened is that's got more and more and more important as the year's gone on. So I think just to summarize an overall regulatory view in the UK, I don't think it's wildly different from the PCOB view that we kind of talked about earlier, which is there is definitely some excellent potential for AI and machine learning tools when it comes to thinking about audit quality. There are certain things that AI and machine learning tools are just better at than people, subtle pattern recognition, looking for anomalies and things like that. But there is also substantial risk to that. And that's really what we are thinking about next. How do we as the FRC say to our regulated communities, in the context of changing regulation, globalization, how do we say to people, we'd like you to use these tools where there is a genuine quality benefit, and we'd also like you to be cognizant of the risks. What is our responsibility as a regulator? Because, some regulators might say, it's up to you, you work it out. You work it out, and then we'll tell you afterwards, we'll do some inspections, we'll do some enforcement work, we'll tell you if you got it right. That's unlikely, though, I think, to lead to a particularly desirable outcome, which is why we at the FRC have been engaging a lot with academics, with audit firms, with people that are using financial information to try to understand how everyone can kind of work collaboratively to reap the benefits of these kinds of technologies and try to avoid some of the sort of bigger risks. I think it's worth taking a moment, though, just to think a little bit about risk, because one thing that I think is quite interesting is, particularly in the UK, the last few weeks of the AI Safety Summit, AI is kind of talked about as a monolith, that there is huge safety concern for all AI all the time forever. And in a way, that's a little bit frustrating because ultimately all AI tools are not equally as risky or equally as likely to create a problem. It feels to me that an auditor that's designed a relatively simple machine learning tool to help them look for specific kinds of journals or to help them with fraud risk is not really the same magnitude of potential problem as someone, looking at an algorithm that's designing unique biological weapons. So one of the things that we're really trying to get across, I think, when we're thinking about regulation of AI is there does have to be a kind of pragmatic approach depending on the risk. Even if we're not doing a full EU-style risk-based approach, we still need to be realistic that all AI and all machine learning tools are not equally dangerous or equally problematic from a societal impact perspective. So that's something we try and keep in mind as we go through and think about how we regulate the use of AI. I presented to our board and to our executive committee a while ago, essentially saying, well, we've basically got 3 ways we can respond to people using AI in our regulatory remit. Option 1 is do nothing, wait for someone else to do it, and then copy them later, which, it works. It's a thing. Apple have been doing it for years from a technological aspect. Turn up 5 years into the fact, do a slightly better job. Everyone thinks you're a genius. Slight problem with that is quite a lot of people are not using tools because they're nervous about how we'll respond as a regulator. So if we just say nothing, then we are definitely missing out on some benefits. We're also, in that context, doing absolutely nothing about the risk, because if people are starting to use tools, maybe they're not using them appropriately, maybe they're training them with data they shouldn't be, putting things into there. In the UK, we have a set of legislation called GDPR, which is General Data Protection Regulations, which means you have to be very careful with people's personal data, essentially. Should you be sticking that into ChatGPT? Almost certainly not. At the other end of the extreme, there's option 3, which is we go all the way full into creating new technical standards for how you should use AI in the financial services environment. So we start putting specific requirements into things saying, if you're using a tool, you should do this. If you're using that kind of tool, you should do this. This is the documentation we expect. Is that in some way appealing? It could be. it probably most effectively mitigates the risks because we're basically telling people what we expect them to do. The problem is that takes a very long amount of time. And as Eric was saying, by the time we've developed a technical standard, and in international standard setting particularly, timescales are geological. So if we start developing a technical standard now, we might have it out by 2042, which is obviously vastly out of date. The other problem that's been touched on by a few different people, Christina, Eric's mentioned it, and a few others, is resource. There aren't that many people that know that much about audit and machine learning that every regulator in the UK and worldwide is going to be able to hire a load of specialists. They're also very expensive. So with that in mind, again, we thought option 3 is probably a bit extreme. So what we're going to do is we're going to take option 2, which is where we basically take our existing standards and guidance, and we say, they probably mostly work for the kind of tools that you're thinking about using, but we need to make sure people are using them sensibly. So we build in extra guidance to help people understand how the requirements in auditing standards and financial reporting standards work in the context of using an AI or machine learning tool. You might make an argument then that, this sort of approach is more challenging than some because it involves us having to produce specific pieces of guidance. But one of the things we've been doing is trying to work on building that capacity so the guidance that we can produce can be actually useful on a day-to-day basis to accountants, to auditors. So what I'm now going to talk about is how the FRC is actually going to do all of that, because it's fine for me to stand up here and say we'd love to do all of this stuff, but I've got to actually start thinking about, what do we need to actually do as a regulator? And also, what kind of things are we actually seeing people in practice? When we're doing an inspection, this year's the first year when we did an inspection where we saw somebody trialing a machine learning tool in an actual audit, which, doesn't sound incredibly exciting, but that was one of the first instances where we've actually seen people think about using these tools. So from an audit and assurance perspective, we still mostly see firms focusing on machine learning tools designed to do a specific task rather than using sort of more general AI tools. And the kinds of things that we've seen people doing, and a couple of these are real things that we've actually seen, tools that aid in risk assessment. So I'm going to talk in a little bit detail about an example from a firm that's developed a tool to help them at a risk assessment stage, which takes 15 different algorithms. Some of them are machine learning ones. Some of them are more basic stats tools, essentially. And it helps auditors to categorize and risk score transactions to try to find risk and then focus there. So that's a tool we've seen actually being used live. Tools that debatch journals, which isn't the sexiest application I've ever heard in my life, but actually is quite interesting. If you've got a huge set of batch journals from an accounting transaction, from an accounting system, and you're spending ages manually debatching it, that's not particularly effective. So a couple of firms, one in particular, have developed a tool that is significantly better at debatching journals than a junior sitting and actually doing it, much more effective and much more accurate. So if these are the kinds of tools that we're seeing, what are we going to have to do as a regulator? Well, we already have standards, codes, and guidance issued. We already have a set of international standards on auditing. So in the UK, we use the IESBA. A large number of the requirements in the IESBA are very similar, if not the same, to those in PCAOB standards. There are some differences. And so our next step as an audit regulator then is to say, well, if this is the standards that we have and the requirements that we have, how do we think they're actually going to work on a day-to-day basis? And so we're going through a huge process at the minute. The actual document for this is a good 65 pages long, which is way too long, and I need to definitely edit that, which basically goes through every single standard that we have in issue. It pulls out every single requirement that is relevant to the use of AI or machine learning tools, and it asks and says, well, does extra guidance need to be issued to explain to people how this works? I'm going to, in a moment, pick out one particular requirement and just talk you through the sort of thought process that we're going through as a regulator. As I was saying, I talk a little bit about the kind of tools we've seen in practice. The one that's, I think, probably the most interesting we've seen from a large firm is a tool which uses all kinds of different algorithms together. So I said the firm's process has 15 different aspects to it. Some of them are machine learning tools. So it uses things like clustering and k-nearest neighbor to help identify anomalous transactions that the auditor should focus on. So what the tool does is essentially takes a giant list of journals. It applies all 15 or some subset of those algorithms, depending on what's suitable for that set of data. And what it gets out is a visualization, a set of visualizations that say to an auditor, some of these transactions look weird relative to the population as a whole. The key thing here, unlike a lot of journals testing tools, is that in this instance, the auditor does not tell the tool what the auditor thinks is strange first. So it doesn't say to the journal that you don't put into the tool, find me round numbers or things that are posted on a Saturday. It allows the tool to determine what is risky for that population, which is quite a big change in how journals testing is thought about. So it's a really, really, really interesting tool. This is still in the trial stage as a thing, although it is going to start being deployed on low-risk audits in the end of this year, beginning of next year. So as a regulator, we'll then see this tool in live use in inspections about 18 months after that. So we've agreed with the firm that we will pick an audit, and they will tell us which one. We will pick an audit where they've used this tool so that we can, well, they'll give us a list of all the audits where they've used that tool. We'll pick one so that we can look at what have they actually done with it? How has the auditors gone from taking a visualization and then deciding how much work they need to do on those risky transactions? So I'm excited about that because that is going to be a really interesting actual live example we'll get to see. So one of the main things that we obviously are concerned about, Christine touched on it, other people have asked questions about it, is the big question around lots of kind of AI applications, and one of the core principles the government is proposing in the UK from a regulatory perspective is how do you actually explain how you've used AI in the context of an assurance engagement? And what is the most important, at least from our view, requirement in the standards? So international standard for auditing 230 is about audit documentation. The core requirement, and the reason it's a core requirement is it's the one we use most for enforcement action, where we say to people, you failed to meet this requirement. And in essence, what it is saying is that the auditor needs to prepare documentation that is sufficient so that an experienced auditor with no previous connection can understand the work that has been done. So what we're really saying then is we're going to start thinking about using AI tools and machine learning tools in audits. They need to be documented in accordance with this requirement, documented in a way that an experienced auditor who hasn't done that auditor before, hasn't audited that engagement for, maybe they're from a different firm, would be able to understand what the auditor's done. Note that it doesn't say you need to be able to repeat it, because this is a kind of common misconception that repeatability is always necessary for an audit procedure. Because one issue people have with things like a machine learning or an AI tool is, well, what if I use it now? You know, and then it iterates, the tool learns, it's better at its job next year than this year. Does that mean I can't ever use it? Does that mean I was wrong in the first instance? I can't repeat my previous test necessarily. You can't repeat the stock count. If you do a stock count at December year end, you can't repeat that stock count 9 months later. Stock's all moved. But the test's still valid at the time. Now, it's a bit more nuanced than that when you think about machine learning tools, but ultimately there is a similar concept there. So how do we get to a point then where we think people are going to be documenting things relatively sensibly from an AI perspective? This here is an extract from a paper put out in the UK by the ICO and the Alan Turing Institute. So the ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. They're responsible for fining people when they lose people's personal data. And the Alan Turing Institute is the sort of leading AI research body in the UK. They essentially laid out this model. Now, this model is more focused on explaining decisions to people who might be receiving a diagnosis, and the doctor may have used AI to help make that diagnosis, is something that Michael talked about earlier. But it also works from an audit perspective. And essentially what they're saying with this model is you take the output of an AI tool, you look at all the other information in the context that exists around it, you put into it human consideration in order to make your decision. And the reason that's really important for us as auditors is explaining AI, the tool itself, is one thing, but then explaining how you use the output to make your choice as an auditor is another thing entirely. And our kind of focus really, we think explainable AI is extremely important. I'm actually going to use some diagrams from Rutgers students' papers in a minute that I think are actually really informative. But a lot of our focus is on how you get to this decision as an auditor. You're happy you've got enough audit evidence. You're happy the entity is a going concern. Maybe you've used an AI model to get to that decision. How do you document each stage of that to get to a point where that decision is justified? You can justify that decision to us as a regulator, to anybody else coming to ask you about it. So a lot of our focus is on AI, explainable AI as a concept, but also on making sure you can actually explain how you've used outputs to make choices. Another way you can talk about human consideration is professional judgment, which I'm going to focus on in a moment, because it's a concept that we've been doing a lot of work on at the FRC. Yes, I mean both to a certain extent. So I'll come on to the next in a moment, because I think both are important. So audit firms do need to be able to think about how they use AI and say, well, you know, explainable AI is important to us as a firm because it means we can understand how the outputs of our tool have been arrived at. But then the output of the tool is only one thing. How you then take that output, feed in your professional judgment to make your decision, what we're saying is we think that's equally as important as being able to actually explain what the tool is doing. So these diagrams, the next two diagrams will look familiar because they're from Rutgers papers. So explainable AI, I think, is a really, really interesting space. And some firms have done more than others when it comes to thinking about how they develop tools and how they explain what that tool does. Because fundamentally, if you're an audit firm, you're developing a tool, and then you're giving it to people to use on a day-to-day basis, somebody somewhere in that firm needs to be able to understand what that tool is doing. It's not going to be sufficient, as Christina was saying, for people to say, I don't know what the tool does. It said this and I started using it. Just like if you're using the work of an expert, it's not sufficient to just say, expert said it was fine, so I just accepted that choice. Most of the tools that we've seen are at the kind of simple model and things like linear regression, decision trees. So another good model there. So this is something that we're thinking about, how you kind of bring this all together. Because one of the questions that we're having is in explaining how you've used AI, and an audit firm thinking about how they develop AI that they can use and interpret correctly. It's complex from an audit firm perspective because engagement teams don't just pick tools up off the internet and start using them. Well, at least we hope they're not. Most firms have a kind of process by which they develop a tool, a set of governance procedures whereby they say, here's a tool, we think it could be interesting. We've either developed it ourselves or we've purchased it from a third-party supplier, or in some instances, it's some kind of open source tool that we've started working with. How do we get it from that to using it on a day-to-day basis? Well, when Mikos and everyone's talking about explainable AI, that's probably something more that the central function an audit firm needs to worry about. What does the tool actually do? How does it arrive at the output that it is giving? Would we expect every single audit file to have a giant explanation of what the tool is doing at an algorithmic level? Probably not. Is that reasonable? Is it necessary? Do we need that on every single audit file? No, but somebody needs it somewhere. So what we've kind of done is divided up this kind of responsibility for explainability and explaining how you've used a tool between the firm centrally, central technical teams, all those firms that are employing loads of data scientists, loads of machine learning experts. And we said these are some of the things that we think you should be thinking about as that central team. And it's much more focused on the explainability of the AI itself. The tool, however, the outputs from a tool are then used to make a choice by an engagement team. So on the audit file itself, the engagement team has to put something on there. They can't just say, I don't know, all the technical stuff is dealt with centrally. They've used a tool, they've got an output, a visualization. So what we're now thinking for is, well, what do we expect what do we expect an engagement team to be putting on their file? And it goes back to that diagram we talked about earlier. How have they taken the output? What other information have they filtered in? How have they used their professional judgment to arrive at a decision? And that's why this model, which is available on the FRC's website, we did a huge piece last year on professional judgment, because ultimately the human consideration aspect of that diagram I showed you is judgment. How do you take the output of a tool and use all of your years' experience as an auditor to come to a decision? So this is available on our website, and there's a few examples. I'm actually currently working on an example that's going to be added into it, which is about machine learning, that I'll very quickly sort of talk you through some aspects of that in a moment. But really what it's saying is that as an auditor, all these factors are really important when it comes to taking a tool, an output, and then considering it. So using your judgment. Do you need to make consultations? Does the output of the tool make sense? Do you need to speak to an expert on it? Are you being professionally skeptical? The output of the tool might tell you something about an entity, but does it work in the context of everything else you know about the entity? Does it fit into your understanding of the entity, its environment? And what we're really trying to get across is that the output of the AI tools isn't just something that exists in isolation. It needs to be used by the people using it to help them make those choices, and then to be able to explain that in a sensible way. Because ultimately, the engagement partner signs an audit report, takes responsibility and says, these accounts are true and fair. They're free from material misstatement. So there has to be something behind that, though, where the team that's working on it has thought through how they've used these tools to help them say, yes, we do have enough evidence in this area. We do think we've identified the right risks. We do think the focus has been in the right place. And professional judgment, really, I think, is probably the biggest area of that. This is an example we're working on at the minute that is going to be hopefully published towards the end of this year, beginning of next year, which is like a sort of addendum to the professional judgment framework. It already has a few case studies in there, but this is an extra case study that we're putting in about the use of a machine learning tool in a journals testing situation. So to Michael's point, this is not about explainable AI. This is about how the person using that tool on a day-to-day basis is happy that they can use it in a way which is standards compliant and that they can document their outcomes. So it's things like, the engagement partner making sure they can demonstrate that they've appropriately thought about whether the tool is the right tool to use in that environment. So the engagement partner might not be a machine learning expert, but they know the entity that they're auditing. So they know what the data quality is like. If they know the data quality is terrible, and yet they still put it into the tool, the question you've got to ask yourself is, well, what was the point? Because if the data is rubbish, I get rubbish in, I get rubbish out. So they're the kind of questions that engagement partners should be able to answer and think about without themselves being machine learning experts. And so really, it's about kind of understanding the process. So one of the examples for that is, engagement partner, if they're looking at using a tool, shouldn't just download a tool, even if it is a centrally developed one that's all been approved, and just start using it. They might want to understand how it's been developed, avoiding automation bias. So talking to their teams and saying, we're going to use this tool in the audit. We've got a good understanding of the kinds of things we need to put into it and how we can use the visualizations. We don't just blindly trust it. We've got to start thinking about things like avoiding automation bias. So that's what we're working on at the moment. We've actually got a case study and two full papers on the use of AI in audit and accountancy that have been ready for a little while. Unfortunately, I've not been able to publish them yet because the government's position keeps changing all the time. And every time I'm about to publish it, someone says something different and I have to change a bit of it. So I'm hoping is after the safety summit and towards the end of this year, beginning next year, maybe everyone settles down slightly so that I can actually publish the work we've been doing, because I think it'll be really interesting. One last thing I do want to focus a little bit on, though, just to make sure it's not left out of the conversation, is professional ethics. So in the UK, we have a bit of an odd situation whereby auditors are subject to ethical requirements from two places. Their membership body, so the ICAW or the ACCA, and us if they are auditors. What do we think are the most important things from an ethical standpoint then when it comes to using machine learning and AI tools in the context of an audit engagement, or anything really if you're a professional accountant? In the first instance, probably professional competence and due care. And again, we're not saying we expect all auditors to become experts in AI or experts in machine learning or even experts in relatively basic data analytics tools. But you need to know what the limits of your knowledge and understanding are, and when you need to seek help from central teams, from specialists within the firm, because people do that already. If you're an audit, when I was working at Deloitte, when we came to auditing tax, I don't know anything about tax. So I'm not going to try and audit a load of tax disclosures. We have a team that do that. I can talk to them. I can understand what they've done. I can understand how that feeds into my work as an auditor. So the idea that an auditor is not an expert on everything they do on a day-to-day basis, but they make use of expertise is not new. Think about audit sampling. If you were to pick an average auditor, do we think that they would be able to explain the statistical models that underlie their firm's sampling methodology? Why is 12 samples enough in this context? They probably can't explain it, but there's a set of tools that the firm have developed and tested over the years that allow the auditor to use sampling as a tool to get to their end goal. Someone at the firm can explain, it's about to be published in the next few weeks, a thematic on sampling. And one of the findings from that is all the firms have a central team that can explain the stats models if they need to. But an individual senior auditor on a day-to-day basis does not need to be able to explain to me as a regulator or on their audit file why that specific kind of sampling technique works at a really kind of raw mathematical level. So the idea that you can think about your professional competence and due care and pitch it at the right level, what do you need to know? Where does your knowledge need to start and end to be able to do your job is not something new for auditors. AI and machine learning is a new area for people to think about, but the concept is there. What do I need to know to do my job?